Our next speaker, he really needs no introduction. I think many of us have read his groundbreaking dissertation. Many of us are here because of his work today as the founder of the Greek Canadian History Project. And we're here to reflect again upon how the junta and the Polytechnic were experienced in Canada, something that he's really educated a lot of us about. Today, he's going to present a paper he's titled Collective Memory and the Greek Anti-Dictatorship Movement in Canada. Please help me welcome Chris Grafos.
Bill and Zakis, to all the organizers, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to say a few things that I think are going to contrast to what you just heard from Sakis, Bill, and Mr. Stan Trainos. But as you heard, my name is Chris Grafos, and I wrote a dissertation called Canada's Greek Moment, which is largely about the anti-dictatorship movement in Toronto and Montreal, and specifically about the response of the Canadian state. Now, that was completed in 2017, and it's available online if you wish to read it. So as I looked up the lineup of today's speakers, I asked myself what additional value I could bring to this conversation and to an event commemorating the Polytechnic Uprising in Athens. So you already heard, and you're going to be hearing from others who were active during that moment. And I know that they'll have fascinating perspectives to share. And so I'm going to speak about this moment and the broader anti-dictatorship movement from a different perspective. That is one of a Greek Canadian kid who grew up in suburban Toronto. And as such, in today's presentation, I want to focus on memory. I'll talk a little bit about collective identity and collective consciousness. And I want to talk about all of these major themes from two perspectives. That is, one, as a Canadian kid born to Greek immigrant parents, and then also from the perspective of Canadian immigration policy and Canadian history, generally speaking. Now, as someone who researched and wrote about the anti-dictatorship movement in Canada, I can tell you that there were many moments that were truly shocking to me. Shocking because I saw the huge difference between how a moment in Greek history is remembered here in Canada versus how it's remembered in Greece. We already heard a little bit about the veneration of the Polytechnic Uprising in Greece. As a kid, I never heard about this once. I'm going to continue here with a question. I'm going to talk about something that might seem completely irrelevant to you, but I can assure you it is relevant. At least I hope it is. And then I'm going to come back to that question in relation to the importance of today's event. The question I want to offer is the following. Whose tanks were those? This is a question I heard here at York in 2009, and we'll come back to it in just a moment. Now, I started as a graduate student here at York in 2008. And at that time, there were few studies of Greeks in Canada. And the ones that did exist were primarily done in the 80s and 90s. And mainly they were large sociological overviews of Greeks that asked some historical, but mostly present-minded questions. How have Greeks integrated? To what extent do they still speak the Greek language? What ethnic institutions do they support? And then how do these metrics and this quantifiable data, how do these things compare across time? Now, in this landscape, and as an aspiring historian, I saw something happen that forever changed my impression of history and the impact that it has on collective memory. And that was the release of Violent August, John Burry's film, which took a less than 100-page booklet written by Gallant, Vitopoulos, and Trichelis, and it turned it into something easily consumable by public audiences. And I saw it being replayed on TV, and it still is. Now, up to that point, as I spoke with people as a researcher, I never really heard anything about the Greek community here pre-World War II. So I never really heard much about Greek pre-World War II immigrants or the settlements. There is one exception to that, I have to say. I think Mr. Moratidis was here. booklet that he had put together about the history of Greek community in Toronto. He's since put out another one, and it shows Greek immigrants and various activities prior to World War II. But for the most part, a lot of people did not speak about this. And again, we're focused on collective memory here, right? The broader perceptions that Greeks have of themselves and of their community. And so it was a little bit different about related to the community in Montreal. But in Toronto, this is what I largely experienced. And what I heard virtually on auto repeat was a story of economic difficulty during a period of the expansion of Canada's multiculturalism project. Greeks came, they experienced material pain, they worked, and then they thrived. A violent August, it changed that. And within 2 to 3 years of its release, I saw how the more that this story became ubiquitous and the more that this knowledge was disseminated of the 1918 anti-Greek riot in Toronto, the more attached it became to identity of Greek Canadians here in Toronto. Things were not always easy. That's what I would start to hear. And I noticed that there was an abrupt change. Do you know how the early Greeks of Toronto were treated? You know, I would hear that a little bit more. So evidently, the theme of explosive ethnic tensions grew to be a part of Greekness here in Toronto. So why am I even talking about this? That's because what I just described is an intimate part or a symbol or an example of how collective identities are formed. And of course, societies and nations, we do this all the time, in that we choose what we remember and we also choose what we forget. And that's an active project and an ongoing project. And so I come back to the question that I posed earlier. Whose tanks were those? Let me give you a fuller picture of that question. The question was posed at a Greek student event here at York in 2009. Now, I'm not exactly sure. I was listening to it from a bit of a distance. So I'm not exactly sure how the images of the Greek students at the Polytechnic became a topic of conversation, but I overheard someone answer, I think those were German tanks. The conversation proceeded. There was not a lot of pushback to that. And then the conversation pivoted to another topic. And I want to highlight something for you here. Most of these students, okay, there was 9 or 10, attended Greek school. They were interested in being members of this ethnic community. They spoke the language. And I believe that somewhere along the line while visiting Greece or, you know, something happened where they saw the pictures. I believe Sakis is going to show the pictures of the tanks breaching the walls of the Polytechnic. And then I started to contrast this with books that I was reading, in particular, Kostis Kornetis' book, Children of the Dictatorship. And then I remember having a conversation with Sakis about this and asking him how the Polytechnic is remembered in Greece. And it was a profound difference from my experience. We were in a different world, in fact. Now, there's no judgment from me, and in fact, this might be a wholly unscientific anecdote. I'm willing to admit that, but I can't help but feel that there's a greater relevance here. And that greater relevance is what I'd like to talk about. From 1967 to 1974, a small group of Greeks, and I say that demographically and relative to the total Greek population, I don't mean that in relation to impact, but a small cohort of Greeks did something that has largely existed in the margins of our collective memory as it relates to Greek immigration in Canada. And it would be wrong if I said that the anti-dictatorship movement in Canada was only Greeks. It was not. But Greek students, Greek organizations like the Pan-Hellenic Liberation Movement and its prominent leader, Andreas Papandreou, and other Greek leaders and organizers were at the helm. And they were positioned in a landscape of anti-colonial, anti-oppression, and anti-authoritarian movements. Interestingly, the significance of a former York University professor living in exile during the dictatorship years and then later becoming Greece's prime minister, and the connection that this has to Toronto has, in my mind, astonishingly faint relevance in the Greek-Canadian collective memory. Now, indeed, many prominent organizations here in Toronto, organizations that are influencers of Greek-Canadian identity, do not venerate Papandreou to be a hero. And indeed, many of the same organizations worked actively to isolate and alienate the most prominent voices advocating for Greece's return to democracy. It's not a judgment, but the contrast to what I saw when I was researching Papandreou. We're lucky enough at the university to have a program called Racer, where you can bring in books from other parts of the world and other libraries. And when I started to read about Papandreou in Greek, again, as I said, we were in a different world. That's exactly what I experienced. Now, Greeks agitating for a return to democracy have also existed in the margins of the community's collective memory for another reason. And that is that most Greeks did not join them. And this was the majority of the community. And I want to linger on the question of why. Well, during my research, I crossed paths with many Greek immigrants who lived in Toronto during the dictatorship years. As I asked, were you ever involved, or did you ever take an interest in what was going on? The answer I received was often one of two responses. First, I feared getting involved. I didn't want any state retribution. I didn't want to be deported. I was fearful of something happening to my family in Greece. And then the second answer, if it wasn't the first one, was one of indifference. The reality is that most Greek immigrants in the 1960s and the 1970s were economic migrants, not political ones. And coming as non-skilled migrants and workers from agricultural or semi-rural settings made them skeptical of public affinity towards this or that political group. And in Greek villages, mutual respect or mutual hostility between an individual and a town mayor, police captain, or other institutions of power had real consequences. And in Canada, the idea for many was to escape that. It was to live in peace. It was to work. Politics, party, or for private organizations, private settings, maybe the cafe, but public affinity was less in taste. And this fear was not unfounded. As I read newspapers from Toronto and Montreal, there were rumors, many articles, of what they called hafiedes in Greek cafes. That means snitches or rats. And as I did more research and I came across what was of concern to the Canadian state, indeed, it was a significant concern that Greece or the Greek government was sending informants here to report back on what people were saying about the dictatorship in Toronto and Montreal and other communities. So the intimidation and the consequence of politics, they were real. And that's the space that my dissertation exists in. So my dissertation is largely a history of the Canadian state's reaction and a perception, reaction and the perception of the anti-dictatorship movement in Canada. So to understand this fully, it's crucial to know that we're talking about the Cold War era. And Canada's Cold War immigration policy was designed to keep out suspected communists out of this country like they were a communicable disease. And anti-authoritarian activists were viewed with an incredible amount of suspicion because they were seen as potential communist sympathizers. Now, there's a great book called Double Standard, and I love that book because it shows, as the title suggests, the double standard that existed in relation to Canada's immigration policy, in that we were dedicated to openness and allowing the world in. And yet, under the surface, there was hostility and a skepticism of immigrants coming with certain political affiliations. So, funny enough, when I put together my dissertation proposal, before I began a lot of this research, I was initially thinking about focusing on something a little more general and talking about Greekness and the symbols of Greekness as they evolved in the post-World War II period. But an archival visit changed that quite dramatically. So in the initial stages of research at Library and Archives Canada, and in the context with the works that I was telling you about earlier, many of the works that existed about Greeks in Canada, it was my perception at the time, wrongfully I might add, that various political protests, speeches, rallies, these were one-off events because the inertia and the energy behind those things, they were invisible to me. And it was the archival record, as I mentioned, that changed everything for me, because in the archives, I just did a mass sweep of everything, and anything that was related to Greek or Greece, I asked to see it. So hours and hours of poring over documents. I saw diplomatic responses to Andreas Papandreou's visit and speech here at Varsity Stadium in Toronto in 1968. And I also saw hints of something else coming up. I'll get to that in one moment. But what was evident was that the narrative, you've seen this on many occasions, most prominently shown in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, but the narrative of Greeks as good immigrants. They came here, they started businesses, they paid their taxes, they did everything right, they sent their kids to school. That was problematized for me as I dug a little bit more, because I saw the prevalence of potential surveillance. So then I did an access to information request about Greek communist activities and Greek subversive activities. And then I saw meetings at downtown Toronto hotels where activists were organizing to put on public displays to bring attention to what was happening in Greece. And I saw this happening on many occasions. I saw in those documents a whole different way that Greek immigrants were perceived. And then finally, I saw how the politics of Greece were brought here to this city and to this campus. And this was all new to me. And here's an example. In June of 1967, Thilo Kuhn, a professor of economics at York University, he used his position here and the affiliation to the institution to advocate for the release of Papandreou from prison. He had been imprisoned by the junta. And in the letter to the director of the Cultural Affairs Division of the Department of External Affairs, so this went all the way up to the Canadian government, Kuhn wrote that Papandreou had been chosen as the first recipient of the Osler-Hammond Lectureship in Economics. And it was his wish that the Canadian Embassy and Margaret Papandreou would deliver this invitation by hand to Papandreou when he was in prison. He brought in the vice president of York University and J.T. Saywell, who was the dean of Faculty of Arts and Science at the time, to send this. Now, J.G.H. Halstead, who was the Undersecretary of the State for External Affairs, he declined the invitation, but he had this quote in one of the documents that I found. The knowledge, when it reaches official Greek ears, that a Canadian university, along with several other foreign institutions, has made him an academic offer is likely to have a positive rather than a negative effect. So the invitation to give a lecture at York University was being used as evidence to delegitimize the arguments that kept Papandreou in prison. There are many, many other moments of great significance too. King Constantine visiting Toronto and the polarized response to him. I often talk about this one moment that plays a big role in my dissertation when King Constantine visited the Greek community at the Granite Club in Toronto, and across the street were protesters who had big placards in the air saying King Constantine is responsible for the tragedies in Greece. And it was a call to the people of Canada and to others to say that what was happening in Greece was not okay, and that King Constantine had a responsibility to bear in all of it. There was a huge procession at Queen's Park. I've used many of these. I think that there were some photos of this earlier that garnered a lot of attention. There was the PAC hunger strike in front of the US consulate here in Toronto. The organization of Students for a Free Greece here at York University. You heard about the organization of Greek Freedom Week. I understand from people that were there that there were thousands of participants. And on one occasion, I have photos of this. They exist in the archive. Greek women in pinstriped garb did a walk around downtown Toronto holding the names of Greek women who had been imprisoned in Greece. And then they ended this with a speech in front of Toronto City Hall. And the images of this is very powerful. So what's the point here? What am I getting at? Well, it's that something very significant happened here in Toronto and in Canada more broadly, and that deserves attention. And it ought to be a part of our community's collective memory. And how the state responded to student activism and to the activism of others ought to be remembered. And above all else, I believe there should be a clear answer to the question, whose tanks were those? Bill and Sakis, thank you again. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the audience for attending today.